All right. Well, January has typically been a more challenging month to line up a program for us, and this year was no exception. Earlier this month, though, I ran into Dave Trissel, Jeff Veith, and Jeremiah Stock out at the Borrego Springs Waste Treatment Center when we were on a chase for the tundra swan. And during that time, we attempted to locate and get diagnostic looks at the local, sage sparrows. And I decided I really needed to take a deeper dive into the identification issues around that complex. So I did what many of us do. I reached out to Paul Lehman, and he recommended Peter Pyle's treatment, which was very illustrative on the subject. And Guy McCaskey also shared a recent trip report from Imperial County that was also helpful. But then I rediscovered the LA Birders November 18th, 2020 webinar by Kimball Garrett. And I thought that perhaps our members would enjoy that as well. Hopefully, most of you have not seen that before. In this pre-recorded LA Birders webinar, Kimball Garrett provides an overview of the status and distribution on bells and sagebrush sparrows, as well as pointers on identification. We'll watch about 35 minutes of that presentation, and afterwards, I'll invite local experts, including Paul Lehman, to weigh in on the status and distribution in San Diego. And additionally, Chris McCreedy, who recently relocated to San Diego and is referenced in the presentation, has agreed to share some of his insights as well. And not to put him on the spot, but he is still in boxes. He just moved here, so he may or may not have any visual aids, but he's got some interesting insights that'll be helpful for us as well. So we're going to pick up the program a little bit after the 3-minute mark, after LA Birders has done their usual jokes and other nonsense. If you've tuned in, you know what I'm talking about. And let me just make sure I can get this thing going. Gotta share screen first. Now you're looking at my whole desktop probably. So let me maximize that. And one more step.
Arrow to advance my slide, and I can just
Can you guys hear that?
Yeah, but we're not seeing it yet, Rick. I don't think your screen is completely shared yet.
Okay, let me try that again.
Okay.
Now
there you go.
Okay. And you were hearing the audio?
I don't know yet. Why don't you go ahead and get it started, and I'll let you know before I mute again.
Artwork for this, and also all the work he did on identification. And I'm sorry he can't join us tonight.
Are you hearing the audio?
Yes, I am. And if people out there can't hear it, you might want to just turn your volume up.
Of the various sage sparrows, and let me just reiterate that when I say sage sparrow, this is what the combined species used to be called until very recently, actually. And when I say that, I'm referring to the whole group, which now consists of 2 species. So, and a thought to be a related species, although we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute, the black-throated sparrow. And then we have, this is the sagebrush sparrow over here on the left with a heavily streaked back, the canescence or Mojave subspecies of the bell sparrow, which is somewhat intermediate in appearance, and then what we'll call the nominate bell sparrow, which is the more coastal, darker subspecies of bell sparrow. So we're going to go through this in detail, but even though this isn't a totally accurate plate, it's still a nice piece of artwork by Alan Brooks. So just an outline of what I want to talk about tonight. We'll go through the history of the taxonomy of the species and the various subspecies, talk about their field marks with a lot of caveats, talk a little bit about the studies that resulted in the split of the species. Very briefly, we'll talk about vocalizations, but that's going to be sort of your homework assignments to go listen to recordings and research that for yourself. Then we'll talk about what we know about the status of the different subspecies in Los Angeles County, of bell sparrow and also of sagebrush sparrow. And then we'll set up the great sagebrush sparrow hunt and suggest places to search and a protocol for doing that. And the protocol will also be on the LA Birders website. So I wanted to start with a photo of a bird and say right up front, we're not sure what this is. And that's going to be a common theme because these are incredibly difficult birds to identify in the field. Larry Sansoni took this photo out at Paiute Ponds just a few days ago, and John Dunn and I were both somewhat stumped, although we kind of leaned toward thinking it probably a Kenneson's bell sparrow. But it raises the point: is the sagebrush sparrow and its very similar relative, the Kenneson subspecies of bell sparrow, are they even identifiable? Interestingly, two California ornithologists, whom many of you know, Michael Patton, who's since moved to Oklahoma, and Phil Unit at the San Diego Natural History Museum, published a paper back in 2002, which was actually an excellent paper because it was on the being more thorough and quantitative in diagnosing subspecies. Subspecies concept has been criticized in large part because it hasn't been applied very sensibly in many cases. There are a lot of subspecies that really can't be diagnosed, or if so, only by average differences. So they made the point that you really need to be able to diagnose individuals such that at least 75% of the individuals of one taxon have to differ from at least 99% in the comparison taxon. So putting some numbers to it. And then these sorts of numbers have been around for a while, but they talked about diagnosability, but then they went on to consider the nevadensis at the time, nevadensis subspecies of sage sparrow, which we now know as sagebrush sparrow, and the Kenneson subspecies of bell sparrow, or at that time of sage sparrow. And they concluded that they were not diagnosable. There, in fact, was such overlap that they probably, nevadensis wasn't even a good subspecies. Ned Johnson had been working on this with co-workers for a while at Berkeley, and then Carla Cicero really took that up. And Carla and Ned published in 2006, this was posthumously published for Ned, kind of a rebuttal to Patton and Unit that said that in fact they are diagnosable. They argued with some of the techniques that Michael and Phil used, especially using specimens that were not from known breeding areas. And then, in fact, they went on, Carla and Ned in 2007, to actually look at this in more detail, look at the overlap zone between Kennesons and nevadensis, suggest strongly that these were, in fact, not only diagnosable, but were distinct species. So, or is the truth somewhere in between? But anyway, it's I wanted to show this picture because it really is a very tough ID issue. And here we're seeing some streaking in the back, but we're not having a really good view of the center of the back. The streaking seems to peter out a bit in the center of the back. The malar streak, which we'll talk about later, is evident, but doesn't quite reach the beak. And this is, again, just a tough ID. So the species, the sage sparrow, or the taxon belli, was first described in 1850 by Casson, and the type specimen was near Sonoma. So we know now, of course, that this is the range of the dark coastal form, or what we now call the nominative bell sparrow. Ridgway described nevadensis in 1874 from Nevada, so these are clearly in the range of sagebrush sparrow. And it's kind of interesting, he called it a variety rather than subspecies at the time, but same thing really. He spelled belli with two I's, which is not correct, and put it in the genus Pospisa. We'll come back to that in a moment. Other subspecies were described subsequently. Townsend described the Baja's California subspecies Cinerea in 1890. The San Clemente Island subspecies described by Ridgway in 1898. And actually the most recently described subspecies is Kennesons, the one that we're so familiar with all through the Mojave Desert, through the Antelope Valley of Los Angeles County, which was described as being distinct from nevadensis by Grinnell in 1905. You'll notice the type specimen was from Mount Pinos, which is actually above the breeding range of Kennesons, but they do move up slope right after the breeding season. There are a couple of other subspecies that have been described. Oberholzer, of course, is famous for describing subspecies which were kind of tenuous in their definition, so we're not even going to deal with these other two on the bottom. So anyway, these are the players up top: Belli, Nevadensis, Cinerea clementi, and Canescens. So how are these things treated throughout our history? Well, the first edition of the AOU checklist way back in 1886 called the species Amphispisa belli. They didn't use the trinomial for the nominate subspecies, belli, or the dark coastal birds, but that's what that refers to. And then they recognized the subspecies Nevadensis. In 1895, same thing, except Cinerea had been described from Lower California, so that's in there. And then in the third edition in 1910, Canescens, we remember that had been described just 5 years earlier by Grinnell, is there, but listed as two species. Belli is the dark coastal bird, and then Nevadensis consisted of nominate Nevadensis or sagebrush, Great Basin birds, Cinerea from Lower California, and Canescens, which is the Mojave, basically the Mojave Desert subspecies. This is kind of interesting because this is the only time Cinerea had been lumped in with Nevadensis rather than coastal bells. By the fourth edition, pretty much the same, except Cinerea had been transferred over to Bell sparrow, and English names were used in this edition for subspecies. The bell sparrow or nominate birds, the gray sage sparrow for Baja, the northern sage sparrow for what we now call the sagebrush sparrow, and finally the California sage sparrow for what we call the Canescens subspecies of bells, sometimes known as the Mojave sage sparrow. Then we go on by the fifth edition, which was the last one that explicitly included subspecies. It lumped everything into one species, belli, or the sage sparrow, with these 5 recognized subspecies. The 6th and 7th editions treated them the same way, but didn't explicitly treat subspecies, although in the 7th edition there was a discussion that indicated that there were 2 subspecies groups, and that Canescens grouped with nominate bells rather than Nevadensis. By the 53rd supplement in 2012, the sage sparrows were removed from the genus Amphispisa and placed in the new genus, which had been erected, called Artemisia-spisa, or the sagebrush finch, or Artemisia finch. And by the 54th supplement, a year later in 2013, the species split occurred between bells and sagebrush. So that, in a nutshell, is the taxonomic history. The generic placement of sage sparrow is kind of interesting because, it was first described in the genus Emberiza, which are the old world buntings, but then so were most of our sparrows at that time back in 1850. And then it was actually placed for a while in the genus Poa-spisa. Here's Poa-spisa, the rufous-sided warbling finch here, a South American bird, which turns out not even to be in the sparrow family, but it's one of these many finch-like birds that's in the tanager family. So interestingly enough, our bells and sagebrush sparrows for a brief time way back when were incorrectly placed in a genus that's actually a genus of neotropical tanagers rather than sparrows. And then the consensus was by 1874, these were placed in the genus Amphispisa. Now the type species of Amphispisa is the black-throated sparrow. So we all grew up thinking sage sparrows and black-throated sparrows were closely related. Interestingly, Amphispisa itself was merged into the big genus Amorphola and the birds of Arizona, Phillips, Marshall, and Monson. No other authors, to my knowledge, have ever done that, and it turns out Amphispisa and Amorphola and the current sage sparrows are really not closely related at all. In fact, the genetic work showed that the sage sparrow was not close to Amphispisa, so a new genus actually had to be erected. This was proposed as Artemisia-spisa by John Click and Gar Spellman back in 2007, but it was improperly published and was not considered valid. And it was revised by Clicka and Dick Banks in 2011 to Artemisia-spisa, and that is the genus that our bells and sagebrush sparrows now reside in. Let me make sure I'm in the right place. Okay, well, where are they? Well, let's look over on the right side first. This is from Grinnell and Miller, which is a book I hope you all have. It's the standard reference to the birds of California. And you can see the 4 relevant subspecies here. So I'm going to just point out Clemente is endemic to San Clemente Island, and very closely related to the coastal bells or nominate bells sparrow. So Bell, this says Amphispisa, just substitute Artemisiosfisa if you want to be current. So these are the bell sparrows of the nominate subspecies belli, all along the coastal hills here from, well, they get up, I know they well north of Lake County, way up into, I think, even southeastern Humboldt County, and all the way down through the coastal ranges into northern Baja California, and a more restricted population on the west slope of the Sierra Nevada. So these are the dark, what we'll call nominate bell sparrows. The sagebrush sparrow is a Great Basin species. So you can see it's in the Modoc Plateau area, and then down in eastern California, down to about the Bishop area. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. And then this big U-shaped population here, actually it's kind of a backwards Y, I suppose, is the canescens subspecies of the Mojave bell sparrow, which breeds up through the up through the Mojave, up to, again, about the Bishop area, all through, of course, here's the Antelope Valley, western Kern County, and a bit farther east on the north slope of the San Bernardino Mountains, and up into the San Joaquin Valley. And there's actually, it turns out, some interesting differences between the San Joaquin and Mojave Desert populations. But this is the range of canescens in California. Sagebrush breeding only in the northeastern part of the state, locally south of Bishop. If you look at the LA County Breeding Bird Atlas, we did not ask atlasers to distinguish between the canescens and the nominate bells, but these are breeding localities or suspected breeding localities for bells, sparrows in Los Angeles County. There are a couple of these that may be a bit generous in assigning breeding status, but this is basically the breeding range, the foothills and slopes of the San Gabriel Mountains, all the way to the northwest corner of the county, very locally in the Santa Monica Mountains, 20 Hills area, and then, of course, all through the Mojave, the Antelope Valley, the Mojave Desert. Don't take this literally, but I have roughly shown a dividing line between coastal bells, sparrows, south of this line, and then in the Antelope Valley, canescens or the Mojave bell sparrows. I won't vouch that every one of these is one or the other, but this is roughly where they divide. And you can see they come in very close contact with one another. So again, Carlos Cicero, and using a lot of data also from when Ned Johnson was alive and working on this, looks very closely at the area around Bishop in the Owens Valley, where both bells and sagebrush sparrows approach each other. And don't worry about all this, but the point is, here's the Owens Valley, here's Bishop over here, this cluster, or Bishop area, this cluster of collecting sites. And this is zooming in on the Bishop area. And without going into great detail, the bottom line is the black bars are birds that are phenotypically sagebrush sparrows. The white bars are phenotypically canescens, bell sparrows. And you can see that essentially south of Bishop, they're canescens, north of Bishop, they're sagebrush. Some areas where they both occur together without any obvious definite signs of interbreeding. So this was sort of the smoking gun that led to the split of bell sparrow from sagebrush sparrow. In ground zero is the Bishop area. You can stand in Bishop and look north, you're basically looking at sagebrush sparrows, and look south and you're basically looking at bell sparrows with, you know, some minor tweaks here and there. Now these are the breeding ranges, of course, and in winter things move around a little bit, but we'll go into that shortly. Just a couple more references, and I've got a list of references also at the very end, but you want to look at, and I think we'll have Mark put these up on the website at some point. Peter Pyle did an analysis of identification of bells and sagebrush sparrows based on specimens up at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, which is largely the same set of specimens that Carla Cicero and Ned Johnson used in splitting the species. And then, of course, Andy Birch's wonderful artwork and analysis that's on surfbirds.com. So we'll put these up so that they're available, or just do your basic Google search and you'll find them. So here again are the players, and I'm going to talk about identification characteristics, but keep in mind it's really, really tough. And we'll be talking about that quite a bit. So bell sparrow on top here, this is the Mojave. These top two figures are the Cannessons and the Mojave bell sparrow. Then the sagebrush sparrow, the two middle figures here. And then the coastal bells are nominate bells on the bottom. Basically, the features to look for are two things: the back, both the color of the back and how much streaking there is and where the streaking is. So in typical Cannessons bell sparrows, the streaking is limited to basically the scapulars, and in a very subtle way, well into the back and sometimes all the way across the back. So you can see that in these two figures. In sagebrush sparrow, they should always have distinct streaking all the way across the back. And finally, the coastal bell sparrows are much darker. In fact, I would say even darker than this individual is shown in the reproduction of this plate, at least on the computer screen, and essentially unstreaked, partly because the background color is just so dark. So you got a very dark unstreaked back in the coastal nominate bells, a somewhat paler, partially streaked back in Cannessons, and an even paler and thoroughly streaked back in sagebrush sparrow. Secondly, the mailer streak. It's intermediate in Cannessons, can be fairly thick at the base, but peters out toward the bill. Gets very thin as it reaches the bill. Sagebrush sparrow has a very indistinct mailer, which basically doesn't reach anywhere close to the bill and is very thin and inconspicuous in most of the mailer, often just sort of a smudge down near the bottom. And at the other extreme, the dark coastal bell sparrows have a very thick mailer, a big smudge at the bottom, and then a thick line reaching all the way to the bill. And those are essentially the characters. There are some subtle differences in grayish, how gray the head is, contrasting with slightly browner body in sagebrush sparrow, a little bit more washed out in Cannessons bells, and much darker, in fact, again, in the field, darker than this in the nominate bell sparrows. Then there's some subtle differences in size. So sagebrush sparrow is the largest of the bunch, nominate bells the smallest, with Cannessons intermediate. And that's its size expressed mainly in wing length, tail length, and bill size. But I don't want to emphasize that because those are not field characters. It's very useful for birds in the hand or museum specimens, but it's really not something you're going to be able to ascertain in the field. So let's look at some specimens. Again, what I've got here from left to right in each of these photos is a sagebrush sparrow, a Cannessons bell sparrow, and the nominate bell sparrow. So you can really see the difference in darkness, from the lightest being sagebrush, the darkest being bells, and in back streaking. Strongly streaked, obviously all across the back. In sagebrush, much more subtle in Cannessons, although some individuals show much sharper streaking, at least on the sides of the back, and essentially unstreaked in nominate bells because it's so dark. And in terms of the mailer, very limited in sagebrush sparrow, variable in all of them, but limited in sagebrush, intermediate in Cannessons bells, and very thick and blotchy in the nominate coastal bells. Here's a different set of specimens, just again from the LA County collections. These are 3 sagebrush sparrows on the left and 3 Cannessons bell sparrows on the right. Again, the main difference that you can see here, at least, is the streaking on the back, which is consistent all the way across the back of sagebrush and can be very subtle in the middle of the back. And this is a fresher specimen, almost absent or sometimes streaking pretty much limited to the side of the back. This is a very recent specimen. The others is somewhat older, which also illustrates how specimens can turn a bit browner over time, a phenomenon called foxing. So the grayness of this bird isn't necessarily a real difference. It has to do with the age of the specimen. So again, 3 sagebrush on the left, 3 canescent bells on the right. I think, and I haven't measured this, so it may or may not be true, but it's my impression that sagebrush sparrows have slightly longer primary projection. We know they're longer winged, but I think that's in part due to slightly longer primary projection compared to canescent bell sparrows, but that has to be assessed carefully. You can't just eyeball it from specimens because this doesn't always reflect the true state depending on how the specimen is prepared. But it might make sense because sagebrush is a somewhat longer distance migrator. Same individual specimens, 3 sagebrush sparrows on the left, 3 canescent bells on the right. Again, showing variation in, but the general strength of the mailer being quite weak in sagebrush, rather stronger in, although it's hard to see in this one, in canescent bell sparrows. And again, the streaking, you're only looking at the sides of the back, so you can't really assess it. So that's pretty subtle, which is why we're not expecting everyone to go out, including myself, and immediately be able to identify these things in the field. One other suggestion is that tail patterns differ, and that's certainly true of the dark nominate belli, the coastal birds, which have essentially very little pale on the outer fringes, outer web of the outer tail feathers, essentially all dark tail and very fresh plumage, a bit of a pale edge. The others have more white on the outer web of the outer rectrix. The National Geographic Guide says that sagebrush has more white than canescent bells, although they're very similar to each other, but bells is canescent somewhat intermediate between coastal bells and sagebrush. Some other guides, at least Rick Wright's Sparrow Guide, suggest the opposite, that canescence has more white than sagebrush. Eyeballing specimens, I don't really see much of a difference between the two. So the point is, don't try to identify sagebrush versus canescence by the amount of white in the tail. I think it's probably not useful at all. And of course, once the tail becomes worn, it's not going to show very well anyway. So thanks to John Dunn, here are just a few photos that are taken from sort of ground zero of the overlap zone, or the area where sagebrush and bells, canescent bells, approach each other in the breeding grounds or even overlap. Although these are winter birds, so remember they do move around somewhat. So these are 3 canescent bell sparrows from essentially the Laws and Round Valley areas of Inyo County, kind of in the upper Owens Valley. Again, a intermediate but fairly evident mailer on all these birds. Back streaking is very subtle and generally limited to the sides of the back and the scapular areas. So these are 3 canescent bells sparrows. And then these are 3 sagebrush sparrows from the same, these are all around Laws and Inyo County. So basically the same spot where some of those canescents were. Much weaker mailer, variable, but in general much weaker. And the back streaking is much more evident. Although again, I would point out that to really be certain, you need a photo that shows the entire back, because a lot of these birds, a lot of canescents will look streaked if you're only seeing, you know, this much of the back. But these birds John looked at very carefully in the field and were streaked completely across. So again, it's very, very subtle. This is, we keep thinking back to Michael Patton and Phil Unit, who felt these two weren't even diagnosable. So it's not easy. So just to review some of the main ID characters, streaking in the center of the back is probably the most important thing. It's distinct and evident all through the center of the back in sagebrush sparrow. It's absent or weak and inconspicuous in canescens, although there can be fine streaks on the sides of the back. And the streaking is essentially absent in belli, which is a darker back bird. The mailer, very weak in sagebrush, does not come close to reaching the bill. Stronger, a bit more continuous in canescens, and even stronger and very thick at the rear in dark coastal bells. The overall head and back color differs subtly, but you really have to factor in plumage, wear, or freshness, and lighting and everything else. Often sagebrush may look a little paler gray on the head, a little browner on the back. There might be some very subtle differences in flank coloration as well. Canescens looks a little more washed out, a little kind of grayer on the back, so not as much distinct difference between head and back. And of course, much darker gray-brown on both the head and the back in nominate bells. As I suggested, but I don't know that this definitely holds up. It's just something to look at. I think the primary extension might be a little bit longer in sagebrush and shorter in all of the subspecies of bells. And finally, although not a field mark, measurements of the beak, the wings and tail are longer in sagebrush. Canescens is a bit smaller. Nominate coastal bells is even a bit smaller than that. Very useful for museum specimens or if you happen to have birds in the hand, but you're not really going to notice this difference in the field. At least I don't think so. I'm not talking much about vocalizations because again, this talk is sort of a prelude to going out and looking for winter birds. But suffice it to say that the songs of sagebrush and bell sparrows are distinctly different, although they're recognizable as sage sparrows in the broad sense, no matter where you hear them. In general, the sagebrush sparrow has a lower pitch song. It's much more mechanical with more buzzy notes, very, very mechanical, repetitious. Bells to me is a little more choppier, a little more complex, almost has a warbling quality, sometimes reminiscent of a blue grosbeak. And canescens, when I say bells, I'm talking about coastal, the dark coastal nominate bells. Canescens bell sparrows are a bit intermediate, but their songs are really much closer to the nominate bells, so not as mechanical and low pitched as sagebrush. As always, go to Zeno Canto, the Macaulay Library, listen to these, pay attention to where they were recorded. Nathan Peplow's guide always has a wonderful discussion of analyzing these sounds. I highly recommend that. In terms of call notes, the kind of little tickling, junco-like notes, to my ear, they're all sort of similar, but I'm sure there might be some subtle differences. I haven't seen any analysis of that. So does this do us any good with winter birds? As you know, some sparrows, white-crowned sparrows, lark sparrows, a lot of sparrows do a lot of singing through the winter. Others, like Lincolns and so on, tend not to sing at all through the winter. To my knowledge, bell sparrows don't do much singing on the winter grounds, but they do occasionally. In sagebrush, I just don't have the experience, but same thing, probably only occasionally. I don't think they sing a lot. However, that doesn't mean they won't respond to playback. So if we're out looking for them, playback might be a good technique to use to see if birds, if you can get birds to respond. I won't guarantee that bells wouldn't respond to sagebrush playback and vice versa, but they're more likely to respond to playback of their own species. So this is your homework assignment. Go listen to especially Zeno Canto and other sources. Macaulay Library, you'll have to wait till Thursday, sorry, but at least I think that one's down too. But anyway, just go research those and consider using playback in the field to look for these winter birds. Obviously, there are situations with breeding birds, certain individuals, where playback's not a good idea, but I don't see any issues here. So where are they? Again, we looked at some range maps, but these are winter maps. I limited eBird data to December through February to look at where these different subspecies are found. Now, bear in mind, this is eBird. Certainly wouldn't vouch for every single record here, especially extraliminal sagebrush sparrows. But the big map on the left is sagebrush sparrow from December through February. And here's LA County, very neatly missed. In fact, these dots are just across the county line, I think, into San Bernardino or up to Kern County. But basically, they can winter quite far north, way up through the Owens Valley and beyond. They tend to migrate farther, so they can even reach northern Mexico, east into New Mexico, and so on. So they definitely spread out quite a bit. and quite a bit south. There's a bunch of records down through the Coachella and Imperial Valleys. I don't know about this particular one down towards San Diego, and a scattering of records, maybe even more if you go back as early as November in the Central Valley that are documented sagebrush sparrows. So we know they move. And I might add that the two Los Angeles County specimens we have of sagebrush sparrow are both from November, one from San Fernando in the San Fernando Valley, the other from San Clemente Island. So it's my thought that any sage sparrow that hits the immediate coast or coastal lowlands or offshore islands is most likely going to be a sagebrush sparrow. Bell sparrows and the dominant coastal birds move very little. Canescens certainly have a strong upslope movement after the breeding season, but I don't know of any evidence they actually reach the immediate coast. So these are sagebrush sparrows in winter. If we go to the right, the upper right map is all bell sparrows. So it's a bit muddled because this is both the coastal nominate birds and the San Clemente Island birds, as well as the Mojave bell sparrows or canescens. So it's more instructive to zero in on birds just identified as canescens down here on the lower right. And you can see that they do move out through the deserts as far as western Arizona, southern Nevada. They actually breed barely into Nevada, but these are outside of the breeding range. Down into the Imperial, the Salt and Sink area. So there is some movement of canescens bell sparrows, but they are very throughout the breeding range from Owens Valley down through the Antelope Valley and up into the southern San Joaquin Valley. They're present, of course, year round. And so these are all winter records from within the breeding range, and then a little bit of scatter, but no records on the coast. But again, these are eBird records, so they're site records, and just, take it for what it is. But it gives you an idea that looking back over at sagebrush sparrows, it raises the question, well, if they're out here in much of the Mojave Desert, the California deserts in winter, why aren't they in the Antelope Valley? So that's for us to find out. What about, and we know there's some breeding habitat differences, essentially bell sparrows in the breeding season. Of course, the coastal birds are very different. They're in the coastal chaparral, chamois chaparral, or that sort of thing. But the Mojave bell sparrows or canescens can be in saltbush, they can be in creosote, but especially saltbush in kind of the low deserts or the lower portions of the high desert. Sagebrush sparrow is primarily in Great Basin sagebrush. But in the wintertime, what are their habitat differences? And here, all I can say, this is a bit of a teaser because Chris McCreedy, PRBO has done, Point Blue has done a lot of work on these in Southwest Arizona, but is still working it up and hasn't published it. So he understandably didn't want me to go into any detail on things that he has found, but suffice it to say that he has found that sagebrush and bell sparrows in winter in southwestern Arizona do seem to separate out a little bit by habitat, or at least are often kind of separate from one another rather than in mixed flocks. Some of the differences might be creosote versus saltbush, bajadas, low areas, or actually washes versus sort of alluvial slopes and things higher up. And also even the company of other sparrows that they may keep are the birds with white crowns or black throated. So I realize I'm not being helpful here in terms of what Chris has found, but I wanted to respect his, the data he's gathered that he hasn't published yet. So that's one thing when we do our great sagebrush sparrow hunt, we want to pay attention to the habitats that we're covering. We'll talk a little bit more about those protocols in just a minute. So where do we look? Well, here's a Google Earth photo. And you guys, a lot of you are local, so you've bird the Antelope Valley quite a bit, which is what I've shown.
I'll stop it there. The rest of the program goes on to look specifically at LA County habitat and to introduce an effort that LA Birders was spearheading to collect data in LA County, which you saw on the map was devoid of a lot of eBird records. So that's Ellie Birder's presentation. And as I indicated earlier, when I reached out to Paul and Justin to find out more about the eBird situation with reviewing, Paul agreed to spend a few minutes with us today. But Justin also, suggested I reach out to Chris McCreedy, who fortuitously, as I indicated earlier, has moved to San Diego County. So let me, if I may, call in Paul right now to see what he'd like to add to the conversation regarding status and distribution, and then we'll invite Chris to the floor.
All right, so pardon my horrible camera with a glaring light. If you noticed on the eBird maps, there weren't many records for San Diego of sagebrush. And that is because the eBird reviewers, of which I am one of, have agreed that we're basically just letting a lot of these records sit in the queue. We haven't dealt with them. We think it's a tough nut, and tougher than maybe some have thought it is. Also, site records are so subjective that it's going to be really hard to deal with those. And even the birds with good photos, we're just letting them sit. There's just a handful that have been dealt with, both Canescens bells and sagebrush in the desert, not farther up in the mountains or toward the coast with the nominate birds, which we're feeling much more comfortable about. So that's the issue with eBird right now, is they're just sitting in the queue, waiting to get our courage up, or for Chris McCreedy to come up with more information, or just somebody else to come up with more. Also would want to say that some of us think some of the just general observers, or even some of the references people are using, might make it seem easier than it is. I think Kimball was alluding to that. I think Peter Pyle's presentation with specimens, which is excellent and everybody should look at, might have made it a little more simple, or everything is doable and there are less intermediate birds than there really are. As for field marks, what we've noticed and what Kimball said is you got to be really careful on back streaks, that you're seeing a full view of the back, not just the side, because then you can't really see the middle of the back. And my experience is, and maybe Chris will say I'm totally wrong, but I see birds that have very distinct streaks on the sides of the back, but then about the middle third of the back, the streaks are very weak or non-existent. And we've called many of those birds Canescens bells. So in other words, more strongly streaked on the sides of the back than Kimball might have suggested, which is another reason you have to have a nice view of the full back and not a view of the side of the back, where you might think, therefore, that the entire back is heavily streaked when it isn't. And then the other character, the maller, I would add that a lot of these Canescens bells, to me, have a nice black, fairly thick maller, the lower half of the maller. Then the next quarter of the maller as you go up gets weaker, but then at least the uppermost quarter that would have joined the base of the bill is totally lacking, or at least it looks that way in the field. So I see some birders say, oh, it had an incomplete maller. Well, I see lots of Canescens bells where it seems to be missing the upper quarter of the maller. And one difference, by the way, is, and Chris can address this, is in Canescens bells, that lower part of the maller is fairly black and variably thick, and is blacker than the gray of the head, which is a pale gray. While in sagebrush, the gray of the maller closely approaches the pale gray of the head, so it doesn't contrast. Lastly, the thing I would say is, when the split happened, the conventional wisdom of us in San Diego, who thought we knew status distribution or had to deal with the records, were that almost all of these birds in the Borrego area are Canescens bells. That's the default sage sparrow out there. And we're going to have to really look hard to find any sagebrush sparrows. So you have to go farther east. What has seemingly been shown more recently is maybe sagebrush sparrows are more numerous than we thought there, especially if you can key in on the right habitat, which Chris can address. However, and I'll finish with this, a real problem may be that everybody is reporting sagebrush sparrows mixed with Connaissance bells. They're having mixed flocks at the settling ponds, at Clark Dry Lake, you know, in the old dump road spot, you know, while Chris's work, as Kimball alluded to, and Chris can now address, suggested he was finding them more separate, you know, that they weren't mixing freely, that, man, I'm sure they do occasionally, but a lot of the times you're finding pure groups of one or the other because of subtle, maybe habitat preferences. But that's not what birders are seeing in Borrego. They're just seeing mixed flocks. Oh, it was 5 of this and 7 of this. There was 3 of this and 4 of that, and 1 of this. So that, I think that is a cause for a little bit of a warning that maybe we don't know exactly fully what's going on. So I would encourage birders in San Diego County to maybe take half a step back and be a little more cautious with these than many of them are. But I think we still have a lot to learn. And as an eBird reviewer, it's a nightmare, which we've shelved for the time being. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. I looked through some of the eBird photos earlier today just to get a sense of what's being reported. And I know the trap I've fallen into is strong barring on the scapular and presuming, because I'm seeing a bird in profile, that extends to the back, and that simply hasn't always been the case. Chris, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Did you want me to share screen, or are you gonna just talk?
I can share my screen here. Can you see, let's see here. Can you see what I've got showing? You see a picture of a sparrow here, a sage sparrow?
Yep, sure do.
Okay. So I haven't had time to prepare. I'm sorry if it's rushed. My name is Chris McCreedy. I worked for a long time with Point Blue. I still call it PRBO. I'll always call it PRBO, but they call it Point Blue now. I was their desert lead, so I managed projects all over the Mojave and Sonoran Desert, in California and a lot of Arizona. I lived in Tucson for a long time. This past August, I took a job with the American Bird Conservancy. I'm their Southwest Riparian Bird Recovery Coordinator. So I moved to San Diego for that. We live in North Park. We just got here, my wife and I. My job focuses on leaf-bills, vireos, and southwestern willow flycatchers and all things riparian. So I'm excited to be here in a big water year. That's really exciting. It's exciting to work with excited biologists who are amazed and kind of scared and interested in what the water is doing to the habitats out there. So it's good to be here. I gave a presentation on this to Arizona field ornithologists back in 2014. All of my externals are in crates, like Rick said, and so I couldn't find that presentation before today's meeting. I asked some AZFO guys to see if they could locate it in their emails, and they're looking as we speak for it. I did find some of the pictures. So we were out there in 2014. I got a small grant from AZFO for, I think it was $2,000 to work on this, and I kicked in probably $3,000 or $4,000 of my own money to do it. We were lucky to get volunteer help from Adrienne Kovac from the University of New Hampshire. She analyzed our blood. So we went out there with a lot of volunteers. It was pretty amazing. We would put up big lines of maybe 5 or 6 mist nets in a row. And my friend Michael Lester and I would each take one end, and we had walkie-talkies, and we would herd sparrows to the nets. Caleb Gordon did this many years ago in Arizona in the grasslands, working on grasshopper sparrows. And then Janet Ruth did it for both grasshopper sparrows and Baird sparrows. That's where I learned it. And it was great. We catch all kinds of stuff in the nets. And we caught a lot of sage sparrows. And so we set it up to do various sites across Western Arizona. Just from my training, I picked sites with different kinds of habitat. We had no idea what we'd find. And we found some interesting things. Let's see where to start. So I guess first for the birds themselves. So this is the 983. I want to get the location in the right spot. Let me go back to the beginning here. Oh, he's coming back out again. Yeah. Okay, so this is a sagebrush sparrow. So we were catching birds. We took their blood. We took all these measurements. We took 1 million photographs of each one. It took us about, I'd say, a day to get the hang of the ID. I think we sampled around, I want to say it was in the 70s. It's been many years now. We sampled about 75 birds, I think. And the genetic analyses helped verify our field identifications. And so I think we got 2 wrong. And those were on the first couple of days. We picked the hardest site. We didn't know, but we picked the hardest site to do first. And by that, the first site was called Robbins Butte. It's on the Gila River, southwest of Phoenix. So bell sparrows make it all the way over there. It's about the eastern extent of their range. And there are habitat differences. They use different plants. You find them in different places. Robbins Butte is a wildlife management area near the Gila River, so it has lots of saltbush. There's Atriplex lentiformis, or quailbush, and Atriplex polycarpa, or all scale. Then Atriplex canescens, which is, I think, 4-wing saltbush. And so it's the kind of site where you tend to see bell sparrows. But that was, I think, really the only site that we worked on where they mixed. But the thing is that you find sagebrush sparrows in more xeric situations like creosote. And we were just learning how to do this, and we didn't know about the habitat differences. And so I think we caught a couple sagebrush sparrows here. And I think what happened was, it's hard to know in hindsight, but we were getting the hang of this whole herding the birds into the net thing, and we started to get good at it. And it was exciting. And so we started to make bigger and bigger loops into the desert to get more and more birds. And I think that on a few occasions, we went out into the creosote to get a really good big loop going. And I think we might have snagged some sagebrush sparrows because we were mixing habitats. And so, and that's, I think, it's part of the reason we made it harder on ourselves while we were learning them. And I think that contributed to us getting a couple wrong on the first couple days. But then we got the hang of it, and I don't think we got any others wrong. There was one towards the end, and I think on that one, the Dr. Kovac, basically this was all for free, and she used our samples to teach her class on how to do genetic analyses. And they were doing a fairly inexpensive one that itself is not always 100% clean. And so there was another bird towards the end that we were pretty confident was a Bell's, and the size was a Bell's, it looked like a Bell's, but it came out genetics sagebrush. And so we've always wondered if that was a lab error. We don't know about that one. But for the most part, we got over 90% of them correct, and we were just learning how to do this. This site, this is near a town called Tacna. It's in eastern Yuma County. It's creosote and really widely spaced canescens, Atriplex canescens, or 4-wing saltbush. And so we only caught sagebrush sparrows here. It was the kind of place where you'd see black-throated sparrows, LeConte's thrashers. Incredible! It was incredible to do this in the winter and find that there were so many rock wrens just out in the creosote. We caught an incredible number of rock wrens just in flat habitat, which was kind of surprising to me. And we only caught sagebrush sparrows here. So you can see the streaks to the back. Cursor. So one thing, so in Kimball's analysis, it was good for Paul to point out the darkness in the mailer streak, that dark gray. I'm not all that well versed in all of my color vocabulary. There's probably a name for that color, and I I don't know it off the top of my head, but there's a really dark gray, almost towards black mailer streak in a canescence that's darker than a Bell's. And that was, in many ways, to me, the key, one of maybe the key, the most important thing. Another thing that Peter Pyle does really well in his presentation that Kimball didn't talk about so much is that the birds look different over the course of the winter. Their feathers are fresher in the fall and they start to wear into the spring. And so Peter points out that the back streaking can get more faded as you get deeper into the winter and as the spring begins. Meanwhile, Peter points out that the mailer streak, because the white feathers, I think the mailer streak can get more bold and darker as the season goes on. So the back streaks kind of fade, the mailer streak can look darker or broader, just more striking. We did this in February. And so I think that's an important thing to think about when you're looking at the birds and you're looking at photographs of the birds. What time of the year was it? Another thing is the back streaks on sagebrush, they tend to be these long streaks down the midrib with these back feathers. I think in Andy's illustration, he kind of draws them more. I hadn't seen it until tonight. They're a little bit shorter, almost fleck-like. And that's kind of, I was like, sometimes when you see streaking in Bell's backs, it kind of looks like that. For me, this darker midrib streak that's long is an important trait to me. So this is a sagebrush sparrow back in Tacna. This is, let's see, still in Tacna. No, this is then. So the next day we were near the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge on the west side of it. Again, this is creosote, ironwood, wash, kind of a Bahada habitat. Again, it was black-throated sparrows and sagebrush sparrows only. No bell sparrows here. One thing that helps in having them in the hand is, as Kimball pointed out, sagebrush sparrows are quite a bit longer in the wing and they're heavier, they're bigger. I think if you, I can't remember if I think we did bell measurements, but I don't remember them off the top of my head. I suspect that sagebrush sparrows have bigger bills. I think that the way it plays out, they're pretty separate. I think that the smallest sagebrush females might overlap with the biggest canescence males just barely, but the sagebrush wing cords, the length of the wing when it's folded can be in the mid 80 millimeters, and you can see bells in the upper 60s, so they're pretty different, and that's a nice tell when you have them in the hand. But anyway, you can see the back streaks here through the back. 605. So we're still in the Kofa. Again, you see, here's some of the variation in the back streaking. This is not as strong, but it does have that sort of dark, almost getting towards black, long streaks in the midrib. This is a sagebrush sparrow mailer streak. Paul and Kimball have pointed out that it's often not as distinct as a bell sparrow mailer streak. We found the mailer streaks to be pretty variable. I think Paul pointed that out. It's the color that I really focused on. In general, yes, bell streaks, mailer streaks are thicker. Something that can happen to birders is you're out there in the field looking at these things and they're moving around and they're fast. And so birders they're like looking for they're looking for the wide mailer streak, and they could see a sagebrush with a decent mailer streak, and they think it's a bell's because they didn't really get a read on the color, which is really hard when you're just in the field. We found that in the hand, when we began doing this, we tried to measure the mailer streak, and we found that even a bird's, each side was different on the bird's face. You'd have different measurements on each side. They're pretty variable because of the white that's mixed in, and because the way the feathers lie. It's just, the color is more important to me than the width of the streak in many cases. Another thing that birders that can happen when you're bird watching out there is you're looking for back streaks And so you can have a sagebrush sparrow that's in really strong light. And so it looks like, oh, I don't really see any streaks. Well, that might be because it's just reflecting sunlight or it's warm. That's a common trap. Another common trap is birders, if they see any streaks at all, they think it's a sagebrush automatically. And it's like, no, bell sparrows can have some streaks. So what I want to stress is that when I'm out there in the field, I don't really feel like I'm going to identify any of them. I do, and you know, especially if you use playbacks, you can call them in and see, and that helps. If you have a scope, that really helps. But I when I'm out there birding, most of the time, not always, but the majority of mine are usually slashes. I can't tell. Sometimes you're in a place. I was recently in what's called Fonts Point Wash, and my wife and I were out photographing flowers, and I had some sage sparrows, and I called them in, and there was a parade of, I think, 8 of them, and I saw 7 really well, and I got photographs of some of them, and they were all sagebrush sparrows. That's to me, that's rare. That doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, I don't get good looks at them. I don't try to get them down to the species because it's really hard. I try to take as many photos as I can and work on those when I get back into the lab or into my offices. I like to call it a lab because I don't like to call it an office. Anyway, let's see. We're still near the Kofa. This is again another sagebrush sparrow back. And so today, Kimball, I looked at Kimball's talk, and he inspired me to like finally just get it done, get it out. When we did this, we did it for not very much money, and I have to work, and I've never found time to finish this study and get the paper out. Kimball inspired me to do it. Today I recruited Teresa Hyde, who you might know. She's going to help me work on it with Michael Lester, and we're going to get it out. So we'll be looking at all of our photographs to see if there are additional traits that might help us tell them apart. But anyway, to keep this moving, here's a sagebrush sparrow at Kofa. Again, here's a sagebrush sparrow at the Kofa with a thin malar streak. Another thing to watch out for in your photographs is camera settings and light really play a role. I tried to help Justin. I went through the past 2 years going into this year of all of the eBird photograph records for San Diego County. And a lot of them I just left as slashes, and it's because you can't get a read on the colors. The lighting's bad, or sometimes camera settings are such that the contrast is really high and everything looks dark. And so you can't see the difference. It's not an easy thing. But here you can see that the malar streak is pretty thin, but also there are some really minor dark flecks in that malar streak, but mostly it's a fairly light gray that, as Paul mentioned, matches the cheek. I would say even on this camera, the contrast settings are kind of high. Offline, if you'd like, I can go through additional photographs through iNaturalist or through eBird with anybody who wants to. I'm happy to look at your photographs and point out some of these things with you directly if you'd like. Here's another shot of that sagebrush sparrow, Kofa. Let me fast forward to some bell sparrows. So this is at Fort Mojave on the Colorado River. So this habitat is kind of similar to the Borrego settling ponds. You've got mesquites, you've got Atriplex lentiformis, you've got a lot of Atriplex polycarpa. We spent 2 days at Fort Mojave near the Fort Mojave golf course, and we caught all bell sparrows. I think it was 27 for 27 bell sparrows. We really wanted to catch sagebrush sparrows and we couldn't. I don't know if we had any black-throated sparrows at this site. We may have, but there were tons of white-crowned sparrows. In general, I found that you tended to see bells in thicker vegetation where you'd find white-crowned sparrows. You tended to see sagebrush sparrows in thinner, more xeric vegetation where you'd find black-throated sparrows. Here you can see on this canescence the dark malar streak. It's a much darker gray, darker than the cheek. Again, it's kind of, I wouldn't call it wide. it's masked by the white that's over top of it, but I wouldn't call it, I've seen much wider bell sparrow streaks than this. Here's the back at Fort Mojave. You can see an absence of streaks. Here's another bell sparrow from Fort Mojave. There are some faint streaks here, but they're a much more pale brown. And as others have pointed out, they're really not through the upper center of the back. Here's another bell. So this whole set is going to be bells until the very end. So here you can see there are some minor streaks. It's kind of, sometimes the way that these feathers kind of ruffle when you have them in the hand, it's like, is that a streak or is that just feather ruffle? I think they're really small streaks in the back. Here's a bells that has some thin back streaks. And so another thing is when I'm analyzing photographs, I find that there is some overlap in the back streaking. Sometimes I can't tell, and I'll tell people it's intermediate. I can't really tell from that streaking. It helps to have different angles of the bird so you can see the malar streak. You can see the color of the malar streak in combination with the back streaking. If I saw this, I would think, oh, it's probably a bells, but it's not. I'm not sure, and that happens a lot. I'm often not sure of them. Here's the same bird with that dark malar streak. Again, I can't remember the bill measurements on these, but it does seem like it has a smaller bill. Another one, again, there are some back streaks and they are kind of long, but they're a much thinner brown, a lighter brown. Here's a more wide malar streak, but again, it's got that dark gray in comparison to the cheek. This one's dark. Another bells. You might see a couple streaks here and there, but in general, these are towards the scaps. In general, the center of the back is fairly unstreaked. This one's pretty unstreaked. Another dark malar streak. And so, and then, yeah. So, and again, this is, you could be like, if you're looking at this, you're like, well, it's dark, but there's a lot of contrast in this image. The settings are high. I'm not sure if that's bells, but then here you have the second one. You can see the absence of back streaking and the much darker malar streak in comparison to the cheek. So after 2 days of this, I was like, you guys, this is crazy. We're just catching bells. We need more sagebrushes for the study. And by this point, we started to get we started to get the hang of the habitats. And so I was like, you guys, let's catch some sagebrush tomorrow. Help me find some sagebrush habitat around here. And so David Vanderpleim and Lauren Harder volunteered a couple days then. And I think they found this site. It was near Boundary Cone, basically due east of Fort Mojave, up on the Bajada. It's just creosote. Again, sagebrush sparrows, black-throated sparrows. So the next day we went up the hill and we started catching these in different habitat with really thick back streaks, huge wings. It's really something to handle only bells for 2 days straight. And then you get a sagebrush in the hand. You're like, oh, it's really different. So I wish that we could do this at the San Diego sites. That would be nice. So these are all sagebrush sparrows. Looking at the data in eBird and in iNaturalist from the sites around Borrego, I have seen photographs of both species at the settling ponds. They're mostly bells. I was telling Justin, it looks like maybe 70, 30, 80, 20. The thing is it's one thing that's tricky about eBird is that you don't have a strong sense of what the birders were doing when they were out there, what habitats they were in. In addition, I think that you can get a situation where you have birds coming in from the more xeric parts around the settling ponds to the settling ponds for water and maybe additional food. In general, we did not really find them. We found the two species to be pretty segregated. Places around the desert where I've seen more mixing are places such as eastern southern Yuma County, near agricultural situations, or western Maricopa County, where we first started in Robbins Butte, kind of like on the edges of the bell sparrow distribution, where you might expect just sheer numbers of sagebrush sparrows to start to, what's the word I want, dominate. You just find more mixing around the edges of the bell sparrow distribution. Kind of conversely, Kimball was pointing out that it's hard for him to find sagebrush sparrows in Los Angeles County, but they find lots of bells. I don't know what Kimball found out with what he was doing. He hasn't told me yet. But I sense that you might start to find mixing on the western part of the Mojave Desert, where you find bell sparrows nesting, especially as you get closer and closer to the breeding season. I think you start to find more bell sparrows in places where you might have thought you'd find sagebrush sparrows in other parts of the desert. Looking at iNaturalist photographs in San Diego County, and looking at eBird photographs, for example, I'm just learning the site names out there, but there's one site, Old Springs Road, I think it's called. And when you're out there, it's pretty sandy. There's primrose, sand verbena, ajo, and I most of the records, all of the photo, I have not found a good unmistakable bell sparrow photograph from that location. There was one checklist, not to pick on Paul, but there's one checklist where Paul had a photograph of a sagebrush sparrow and then 3 bell sparrows that were not photographed. And I thought, well, maybe Paul's a good birder, but that habitat, that to me, that's a good challenge. To me, I'm like, really? Were there really bell sparrows out there? Because I haven't seen a photograph of it yet. I've managed to find one photograph of a possible bell sparrow from Clark Dry Lake from Thomas Ford Hutchinson, but his photograph isn't very good, so I'm not sure. Most of the other photographs I've seen from that valley and the ones that I saw at Fons Point are sagebrush. So my feeling is that it's similar to other locations where you'd expect bells around the settling ponds where it's atroplex and mesquite, thicker vegetation, and I'd expect sagebrush sparrows in some of the more dry situations outside of the settling ponds. And again, to stress, from an eBird checklist, you can't tell exactly what the birder was doing. So if somebody was at Old Springs Road, they may have wandered into some bell sparrow habitat. It's really hard to tell just from an eBird checklist. One thing that's nice about iNaturalist is that assuming that the person mapped their photograph accurately, which isn't 100%, but most of the time people are pretty diligent about that, you do start to see some of those patterns. So I hope I didn't talk too long, Rick. I didn't really know what I was going to say. I'm happy to answer any questions all the time. I'm sorry it's taking so long to get this out. It's been a long sort of 5 years, and with a lot of other work to do. And so, but we're working on it. That's all I got.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. Chris and I just connected for the first time a couple of days ago after Justin referred him to me, and he hadn't even seen Garrett's presentation until I think yesterday. So when I sent him the link, so really appreciate it, Chris. It's late. I don't know if there's questions that we want to entertain. I think that a couple of takeaways for me is, one, I'm going to start making note of habitat, particularly plant assemblages. Clearly, that's an important attribute that I am just blowing off as a guy who's just listing birds. So that's one takeaway that I've got. And another is really a question for the reviewers. You talked about those photographs being overly contrasty, and I know that many of us, those of us who get around to processing photos, which is usually my downfall, I don't get around to doing it. But when we do, we want to make our photos look good. So people spend some time post-processing. I'm just wondering if the raw files aren't maybe of more help to the eBird reviewers or just to the database in general. So those are questions I'm going to look at a little bit more.
I think there are a few questions in chat also.
Yeah, and I do want to say that I took the opportunity to put into the chat the link for Peter Pyle's document. So if anybody wants to be able to access it, you can access it in the chat. And click on the link and it will take you to the PDF that Peter Pyle put together on the sparrows. Sorry, Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a few questions that are in the chat. One on the departure dates of the bells versus the sagebrush. And also the identification of these coastal migratory bells that we see at Point Loma and on the, I mean, right on the coast, right on the cliffs in migration. And they're supposed to be sagebrush, I think, because they're migratory, but they look so dark. But also, the most important question that I wanted to ask, Chris, is that I noticed, or my data points aren't that great, but I noticed that the sagebrush sparrows are still present after March 1 and 2, and yet the bells are gone by then. So, I checked. I was there during the early part of March, and the bells that had been all through the settling ponds were all gone, and there were quite a few that year that were in that area, and they were just gone. And I realized that, and I agree, and like Paul, I think I have seen a mix of two species at Old Springs Road, but most of them are sagebrush. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, on March 2nd, while all the traditional spots in Anza Borrego for the bells seem to be cleaned of bell sparrows, when I went to Old Springs Road, right next to the dump, there were flocks of sagebrush. And I want to bring out the point too that I think most birders, most careful birders, when they're looking at these sparrows, they want to get a really good look, and they look from all angles, and sometimes often with a scope. And they will number the birds that they can't identify, but usually in these areas there are more one type, like you say, than the other. And those we make sure, looking from different angles with our binoculars or scopes, that we know that we're somewhat confident of, with multiple marks, what they are. But anyway, this whole thing about bells leaving earlier than the sagebrush, I talked to Guy about that, and he thought that because the sagebrush breed higher in higher elevations, that they that might be the reason why they stuck around in the desert in the winter months longer than the bells, which is an interesting point. Also, I was thinking, if it's true that these two sparrows are separated as much and also have different migratory, that it would be interesting to study the birds that still remain in early March, which may be all sagebrush sparrows, to see what the variation is in them as far as, because this is late in the winter. Mm-hmm. I was just interested in hearing your opinion on that, and also the opinion of other birders, SDFO birders.
The last few years, what I can say is I was working on, there's a subspecies, or they think, we're not sure, but there's a listed subspecies called the Inyo California Towhee that's endemic to the Argus Range in the Mojave Desert near Ridgecrest. And so for the past few years, I've been surveying those for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM. And we did a genetic study on them. We caught birds all the way up to Oregon. to see, working with Purdue University, to see how distinct the Inyo California towhee population is. And I would typically be out there starting my surveys for the towhees around the second week of April. And by the time I start, the bell sparrows are already territorial, singing, nesting, well into it. So whereas, I used to live in Lee Vining near Mona Lake, and I've got a lot of friends up there, and I'm seeing a lot of photographs of a lot of snow. And I don't really think that the sagebrush sparrows are going to be nesting up there in mid-April, maybe, but it's still pretty cold up there. So there might be something to that, the sagebrush sparrows staying later down here, and that's why. I think in general, I haven't thought about that too much, but my general memory from the sites in Arizona where you see bells is that it starts to get pretty hard to find them entering March. And I do remember there was a photograph, a record, I think it was at the Settling Ponds from, I want to say March 7th or so. And if I remember right, it was called the Bells. And I was thinking about it, and it was a tough one. And I was like, well, I don't really, for one thing, I'm not sure that is a Bells from what you have in that photograph. And on top of that, that's getting pretty late for bells. And so I remember thinking about that. I think I recommended to just call that one a slash. But I haven't been out there at Eastern San Diego at a month from now, at 6 weeks from now, to see the mix, to see what's there. I've only been out there this year, just last weekend with my wife, and we got to the Settling Pond, and it was already getting close to sunset. So I didn't have time I didn't find either species there that afternoon. So I have, I guess, more work to do out there to see what's there.
Well, and Chris, the point you made about you don't know from eBird where the person was when they actually saw the bird. So
Yeah.
we had a very well-known sagebrush sparrow there that was quite a distance away from the actual pond, but we knew where it was. It came back several winters in a row, and it was always in the same basic area. So I'm sure many of the photos are of that exact same birds, because a lot of us
know
was there. And so
Yeah.
that kind of distorts the picture of what, what's being presented, 30% versus 70%. I would say most of the ones there are bells. I agree with you. Whereas, but if you wander off, you really are in a different habitat. So
it would be fun to put up some nets there to see what you get. Definitely.
Yeah. So anyways, I want to say thank you very much. Are there any other questions that people have? We're about half hour over. I don't mind. I think this was a very productive conversation to have. No? All right.
Well, let me put my email in the chat for you.
We can include it. We can include it when we email the link to this presentation as well.
Perfect.
Okay.
And someone texted me for an address on how to join and everything. And I will respond to that person. But if anyone out there doesn't know, you can go to the San Diego Field Ornithologist website. The address to mail your check is listed there. So please, step up, and we enjoy seeing everybody.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I look forward